team of military engineers backed by millions of dollars in equipment stood powerless against the mud. And the only person who knew how to get them out was an 81-year-old man without a uniform. Why did strength machinery and education all fail while battlefield experience did not? The steel cable snapped with a sound like a gunshot. It whipped through the air, missing a young soldier's head by inches, then slammed deep into the trunk of a tree behind him. The tactical transport truck, weighing tens of tons, sat frozen in place, thick clay mud, clinging to the wheels as if it intended to swallow the entire steel frame. Lieutenant Ethan Brooks shouted orders through the rain and the roar of engines. He was an engineer by training, trusted the numbers, believed that more force would mean escape. Pull again, increase power, change the approach. Orders followed orders, but the truck didn't move. 30 seconds passed. No progress, only sinking deeper. The entire team stood in chaos mud up to their knees, sweat and pressure etched across every face. At the edge of the road, far from the shouting and the engines, an old man stood leaning on a cane. He said nothing. He simply watched the wheels and the ground beneath them. No one noticed him. No one yet knew that the man being ignored was the only one who truly understood how to get out of this place. If you believe that true courage is not found in gunfire but in the quiet strength of those who have walked through war, subscribe to Service Honor Stories so together we can preserve the memory, dignity, and reverence owed to our heroes. The formation came to a halt, as if something had grabbed it from behind and refused to let go. The frantic shouts from moments earlier faded, replaced by a heavy, oppressive void. The engines were still running, but no one believed they would produce anything now except heat and the bitter smell of burned metal. Mud clung thickly to the wheels, polished smooth until every trace of tread was gone. The winch cable sagged, darkened by mud and oil, no longer a tool of rescue but a reminder of failure. Lieutenant Ethan Brooks stood still, his hand clenching, then releasing. The numbers that once gave him confidence no longer came clearly to mind. Torque, coefficients of friction, engine output, everything was correct on paper. But in front of him, the truck remained motionless. He looked at the wheels, then down at the mud, and for the first time he understood a simple, bitter truth. Textbook knowledge could not make something stand up once it had been swallowed. "Stop!" Brooks said, his voice calm but final. No one objected. No one asked questions. The order was not a retreat. It was an admission that every effort so far had been meaningless. The sergeant beside the truck crouched down, touched the engine housing, then pulled his hand back quickly from the heat. Another soldier looked at the winch cable and shook his head almost imperceptibly. No explanation was needed. Everyone could see it now. There were no remaining options in anything they had been taught. Silence spread not from fear, but because no one knew what to say next. Brooks drew in a slow breath. He felt the eyes of his men on him, not waiting for a new command, but waiting to see how he would face this failure. He turned his head, looked back down the road they had come from, then returned his gaze to the truck still buried in mud. For the first time that day, he did not shout. He did not issue orders. He simply stood there quietly. At the edge of the mud field, Walter Roy Hayes remained where he was. The cane in his hand rested lightly against the ground, just enough to steady him. He did not look at the people first. He looked at the earth. He studied the mud, the depth of the ruts, the way water pooled around the wheels. His gaze was unhurried, unjudging, as if he were reading a language long familiar, one others had forgotten how to understand. A young soldier glanced in his direction, then quickly looked away. In that moment, Roy was neither an outsider nor a solution. He was simply a quiet presence in stark contrast to the noise and urgency that had come before. His silence drew no attention, but it carried weight. Brooks looked back at the truck. He realized he had spent the entire morning trying to defeat the mud instead of understanding it. He thought about lectures on engineering, about controlling situations with data and formulas. None of them had explained what to do when the ground refused to cooperate. None of them had warned that sometimes the harder you pull, the deeper you sink. "We're fighting something we can't win," Brooks said almost to himself. No one answered, but a few heads nodded. It was not loud agreement, just quiet acknowledgement. Roy shifted his cane slightly and stepped forward. He stopped again, still silent. He did not interrupt. He did not signal. He waited. To him, this moment was familiar, the moment when people realize they have reached the limit of brute force and need a different way of thinking. He had seen it long ago in days when delay meant danger and pride could cost lives. Brooks raised his head, his eyes sweeping the area. This time his gaze settled on the man with the cane, not out of curiosity, but from a vague sense that something important was being overlooked. Roy did not avoid his eyes. He simply looked back, calm and steady. And it was in that silence, when every command had been spent and every familiar option had collapsed, that a voice rose. Not loud, not rushed, but strong enough to crack the stillness and pull the story in a different direction. "What are you doing standing there?" Lieutenant Ethan Brooks snapped, his voice sharp with exhaustion and pressure. "This is a military area. You need to leave immediately." The words cut through the thick mud field, not loud, but sharp enough to break the silence that had just begun to form. A few soldiers turned to look. No one laughed, but no one objected either. In their eyes, Roy was simply an outsider who had wandered into the wrong place. Walter Roy Hayes stopped. He did not argue. The cane in his hand remained still. His gaze did not waver. He simply watched the wheels sinking a little deeper with each passing moment. That calm, instead of easing the tension, only irritated Brooks further. "We understand physics." Brooks continued, his voice rising. "We're trained for this. You don't need to stand here watching and guessing." It wasn't just a dismissal. It was an invisible line drawn between two generations. One side believed in formulas, charts, and academies. The other stood on memory and the ground itself. And in that moment, the younger generation held authority, while the older man was pushed to the margins. Roy nodded slightly, as if he had heard those words long ago in a very different time. He did not respond, not because he had nothing to say, but because he understood that when people are under pressure, they often confuse confidence with defense. Brooks turned away without waiting for an answer. He raised his hand in command. "Prepare to pull again. Increase force. Change the angle." The orders were repeated, but this time the voice behind them had lost its earlier certainty. Engines roared. The winch cable tightened. Mud around the wheels trembled like a living substance, ready to swallow anything that resisted it. Roy stepped back half a pace, stopping exactly where Brooks had pointed. He watched in silence, an unwilling witness. His eyes followed the movement of the wheels, then settled on the way the mud collapsed inward the moment more force was applied. He had seen this before, not here, but in places where mistakes did more than trap vehicles. "Keep going," Brooks shouted. The truck lurched. The wheels spun violently, polished smooth as if freshly buffed. The chassis shuddered, then sank another few inches. A soldier slipped, grabbing the side of the truck to keep his footing. The winch cable shrieked with a dry, metallic cry. "Stop!" someone shouted from behind. But it was too late. A heavy sound followed as all pulling force vanished at once. No progress. Only more mud clinging to steel, more heat pouring from the engine, and more frustration spreading through the unit. Brooks froze. His face flushed red. He stared at the wheels, then up at the cable as if expecting them to explain the failure themselves. His jaw tightened. No one spoke, but everyone understood they had made it worse. Roy watched his brow furrowing slightly, not in anger but in concern. He glanced at the young soldier who had nearly fallen, then back at the slackened cable. Old images passed through his mind. Hurried pulls, decisions made on strength instead of understanding, and the cost that followed. "See." Brooks turned back, his voice lower now, but still sharp. "This isn't about logs or tricks. We're following proper procedure." Roy looked at him. This time he didn't look away. His eyes were no longer fixed on the ground. They met the young officers directly. There was no challenge in them, no contempt, just the gaze of someone who had been here before under different circumstances. Brooks waited for a rebuttal, for resistance, but Roy remained silent, another beat. That silence unsettled Brooks. It made him feel as if he were standing in front of something unsaid, something not found in any manual, yet present beneath their feet. The mud sagged again around the wheels, as if to underline the truth that the last pull had been nothing more than a useless loop. No one mocked Roy, but the quiet disdain was unmistakable. He didn't belong here, not in this place, not in this time, and not in the technical equation Brooks was trying to solve. And it was precisely when that distance reached its breaking point, between faith in machinery and the memory of the battlefield, that Roy took one more step forward, close enough that his first words would no longer be ignored. "Don't come any closer." Lieutenant Ethan Brooks raised his hand instinctively. "This area isn't safe." Walter Roy Hayes didn't stop. He stepped down into the mud, each step slow but steady. His boots sank deep mud climbing around his ankles, but he didn't look down. His eyes were fixed on the wheels and the hollow beneath the truck's frame, the place where the last pull had caused the mud to collapse inward like a closing mouth. "You don't understand," Brooks said quickly, as if trying to regain control. "We're handling this by procedure. The cable can take the load. The pull angle has been calculated." Roy stopped a few steps from the wheels. He bent slightly and touched the surface of the mud with the tip of his cane. It didn't spring back. It was dense, heavy clinging. He tapped it once more, then looked up. "You're pulling a dead thing," Roy said, his voice low and clear. "And you're trying to pull it out of a vacuum." "There is no vacuum," Brooks cut in. "It's friction. We just need more force." Roy shook his head. "No." He pointed to the spot where the mud had collapsed. "This is the vacuum you created. Every time you pull, you compress the mud. You can't beat it with strength." A few soldiers exchanged glances. No one spoke. They looked at the slick, polished wheels, then back at the cable that had just been tightened again. The truth was right there, but no one had named it yet. "You don't have authority here," Brooks said, his voice sharpening. "I'm responsible for this mission." Roy turned toward him. For the first time, he looked Brooks directly in the eyes. "I know," he replied, "and because you're responsible, you should listen." Brooks stepped closer. Listen to what Roy didn't answer immediately. He pointed toward the wheels, then lifted his hand slightly, as if raising something invisible. "You don't need more force," he said slowly. "You need to let the truck stand up." Silence fell. The words weren't loud, but they struck the thing everyone had been avoiding. Stand up. Not pull, not jerk, not fight the mud. Stand up on what Brooks shot back. "There's no base, no traction." "Because you keep pulling it forward," Roy said, "when what it needs is to climb." "Climb with what Brooks asked, half challenge, half uncertainty." Roy gestured with his cane toward the edge of the mud field. "With what's already around you." He paused for a beat. "And by giving the wheel a leg to step on." A soldier whispered, "What does he mean?" Brooks heard it. He drew a breath, steadying his voice. "We don't have time for guessing. There's a deadline." Roy nodded. "I know what a deadline is." He glanced at the watch on Brooks's wrist. "And I know you're running out of options." "What are you proposing?" Brooks asked, his voice lower now. Roy scanned the area quickly. 10 minutes, he said. "Give me 10 minutes. Or you keep pulling until the truck sinks deeper, more equipment fails, and someone gets hurt." Brooks was silent. Wind moved across the mud field, carrying the smell of hot oil. A soldier wiped mud from his face and looked at Brooks, waiting. The look wasn't demanding. It was patient. 10 minutes, Brooks repeated. 10, Roy said firmly. "If it doesn't work, I'll walk away." No arguments. Brooks studied him. In the man standing before him, he saw no impatience to prove himself, no provocation. Only the calm certainty of someone who had once wagered far more than a single mission. "And if it works," Brooks asked. "Then you learn another way," Roy replied. "One that isn't in the books." Brooks turned back to the truck. He remembered the helplessness he had just felt. The eyes of his unit. He turned around again. 10 minutes, he said. "But you follow my orders." Roy allowed a faint smile. "You can keep that authority." Brooks raised his hand. "Stand down. All operations stop." Engines powered down. The cable slackened. No one objected. In that moment, authority didn't disappear, but it shifted, away from shouting and brute force toward focus and a different idea of how to move forward. And as the old commands fell silent to make room for one final attempt, the entire unit stood and listened, for the first time not because of rank, but because they were about to witness something that demanded acknowledgement. Lieutenant Ethan Brooks held still for one more beat. He looked at Roy, then at the formation behind him. The mud-streaked faces were no longer waiting for the familiar command. They were waiting for a different decision. Brooks nodded slowly, but firmly. "All right," he said. "We'll try it your way." There was no sigh of relief, no murmuring, only a subtle change in the air like an invisible door opening. Roy didn't thank him. He didn't claim victory. He stepped forward, his voice low and precise. "I need 2 solid logs, long enough to span the wheels. Now." Daniel Cruz turned before the sentence was finished. Mark Hill followed without hesitation. They didn't look to Brooks for confirmation. They listened to Roy the way one listens to an order that's been trusted for a long time. Their footsteps broke from the formation, quick, decisive. "Chains," Roy continued. 2 lengths. Heavy duty. Bring them here." Roger Cruz replied, even though Roy wore no rank. Brooks realized it only after it happened. No one was deliberately bypassing him. No one was challenging his authority. But in that moment, authority had shifted. Not because of insignia, but because of clarity. Roy studied the wheels, then looked up. "Driver, bring it into position," he said. "Lock the differentials. Low range." Brooks turned to the driver. "Do it." The driver nodded. No hesitation. No questions. These short commands didn't require explanation. They were spoken like something tested by time, by situations where mistakes couldn't be repeated. The two logs were dragged over. Heavy. Wet. Roy pointed. "Lay them across the wheels, tight against the tire." Hill crouched and followed the instruction. Crews held the log steady. They worked in sync as if they had done this before. Brooks stood nearby, watching. Every movement had purpose. Nothing wasted. Nothing rushed. "Run the chain through the rim," Roy said. "Cinched tight. Make it part of the wheel." Brooks listened to the way Roy spoke, not issuing orders through authority, but guiding through certainty. He found himself thinking of training sessions where instructors talked about leadership under pressure. But this wasn't a lecture. This was action. "Set," Cruz said. Roy nodded. "Other side." They repeated the process. Faster now, more confident. Brooks saw the formation shift from waiting to working. Doubt still lingered, but it no longer slowed their hands. "Listen up," Roy said, raising his voice just enough for everyone to hear. "No jerking. No sudden throttle. Slow, steady. Let the torque do the work." The driver looked at Roy in the mirror, then at Brooks. Brooks nodded. "Follow his lead." The words weren't loud, but they marked something Brooks had never done before, publicly placing his trust in someone outside his system. Not from a lack of responsibility, but from the realization that what was missing wasn't control, it was experience. Roy stepped back. "When I signal move," a soldier whispered. "Are we really doing this?" "Yeah." Hill answered quietly, "Yeah." There was no laughter, no sarcasm, only focus. Brooks looked at Roy. In that moment, Roy was no longer an old man standing on the edge. He stood at the center of a collective decision. No one had granted him authority, yet everyone was acknowledging it. "Ready," Roy said. All eyes fixed on the wheels. The mud hadn't changed. The truck was still heavy, but the way they faced it had. And as the unit shifted from doubt to action, from waiting to trust, a truth began to surface, not about the power of machines, but about wisdom that had been waiting to be heard. "Watch closely." Roy said, his voice not loud, but strong enough to draw everyone's attention. "You're not pulling it out. You're letting it move itself." He pointed to the log that had been secured firmly to the wheel. "This isn't for traction," Roy continued. "It's a leg. When the wheel turns, that leg hits the ground. The wheel stops slipping. It's forced to climb." Brooks followed the direction of Roy's hand. He saw what he had missed from the beginning. The problem wasn't pulling force, it was the point of contact. "You're increasing the wheel's radius," Brooks said slowly, as if assembling scattered pieces of knowledge. Roy nodded. "Exactly. And you're creating a solid surface. The mud won't give you footing, so you bring the footing with you." "No throttle spikes," Roy added, turning to the driver. "Steady, slow. If you jerk it, everything breaks." "I understand," the driver replied, his voice hoarse with tension. Roy raised his hand, then lowered it. "Go." The engine rumbled. The wheels began to turn. The log struck the ground. A heavy sound followed as force transferred into the mud. The chassis trembled slightly, as if hesitating. Then the wheel climbed. No jerking. No slipping. Just a slow, deliberate motion, like a massive creature standing up after being pinned down for too long. "Hold," Roy said. The truck moved forward, another stretch. The front wheels reached firmer ground. The resistance from the mud dropped noticeably. The entire unit stood frozen. No one cheered. No one spoke. They stared at the truck, hardly believing what they were seeing. "Stop," Roy said precisely as the log was about to complete its rotation. The driver hit the brakes. The truck rested on higher ground, still coated in mud, but free. No pulling. No added force. It had walked itself out. No way, a soldier whispered. "Are we—" Outhill asked, his voice unsteady. Brooks stepped forward, inspecting the wheels, the undercarriage, then the log. No damage. No signs of overload. Everything intact. He turned to Roy, his expression changed. No suspicion. No defensiveness left. This method, it's not in the manuals, Brooks said. Roy shrugged. Because they assume you'll always have a recovery vehicle. Where did you learn it? Brooks asked. Roy looked at the truck, then beyond it, as if seeing through years. Europe, he said. The Ardennes forest. Winter. Brooks stiffened. World War II. Roy nodded. We called it the unditching beam. Younger folks later called it the Patton Twist. Brooks took a deep breath. Patton. Third Army, Roy said simply. Running supplies day and night. If you got stuck, no one was coming to pull you out. So you learned how to let the wheels save themselves. The name George S. Patton echoed across the mud field like a bridge to the past, not to boast, but to place everything in its proper context. Brooks stood still. He didn't speak right away. In his mind, history lessons suddenly became tangible. No longer pages in a book, no longer documentary footage. They were standing in front of him, holding a cane, speaking in a calm, steady voice. You were... Brooks began, then stopped. Just someone who once drove through mud, Roy said, and survived. A few soldiers exchanged glances. Their shock didn't come from the truck being freed, but from realizing they had just been taught by a living witness to history. No medals, no speeches, just a technique, a decision, and a result that couldn't be denied. Brooks extended his hand. Thank you. Roy shook at his grip, not strong, but firm. Remember this, he said. Technology changes. The ground doesn't. Brooks nodded. In that moment, he understood he hadn't just learned how to recover a vehicle. He had learned how to listen to things no longer taught in academies. And once the technique had finished its task, the story began to turn in another direction, where what was passed on was no longer just a way out of the mud, but a lesson in humility and honor. Lieutenant Ethan Brooks straightened himself and slowly stepped in front of Roy. Mud still clung to his pant legs, but his voice had changed. It was no longer rigid, no longer defensive. I owe you an apology, Brooks said. I thought I knew enough. I was wrong. Roy looked at him calmly. He didn't smile and he didn't look pleased. You weren't wrong because you lacked knowledge, Roy replied. You were wrong because you thought knowledge always wins. Brooks nodded. I put my team in danger. He turned toward the soldiers standing nearby. And I didn't listen. Roy waved his hand lightly. Don't make it personal, he said. What matters is that you stopped in time. A young soldier spoke up, his voice still shaking with emotion. Sir, if we had pulled one more time, someone could have been hurt. Roy cut in. Not loud, but firm enough to end the thought. Cables don't forgive. Neither does the ground. Brooks looked at the slackened cable, then at the soldier's hands. He swallowed hard. You saved us from ourselves, he said. Roy shook his head. No, he replied. I just reminded you of something old. He looked down at the ground and tapped it once lightly with the tip of his cane. The ground always wins if you fight it. You don't need to beat it. You need to understand it. A silence opened up. No one interrupted. The words weren't lofty philosophy. They were conclusions forged over years, paid for again and again. Brooks felt that weight. He looked at Roy, then bowed his head slightly. Not out of required protocol, but voluntary acknowledgement. I'll rewrite the report, Brooks said. Not just the technical parts, the decision-making. Good, Roy replied. But don't put my name in it. Brooks looked surprised. Why? Because this doesn't belong to me, Roy said. It belongs to your team, and to the people who'll read that report someday. Brooks was quiet for a moment, then nodded. I understand. Another soldier stepped forward. Sir, how long did you serve? Roy looked at him, his expression softening. Long enough to know when to speak and when to stay silent. Brooks took a deep breath. He turned and stood at attention. Formation, he said. The soldiers immediately straightened. No explanation needed. Brooks turned back to face Roy and raised his hand in salute, slow, precise, unshowy. Roy hesitated for the briefest moment. Then he shifted his cane to his left hand. He straightened as much as his age would allow. He raised his right hand and returned the salute. It wasn't sharp like a young man's, but it was steady, practiced. No one spoke. There was no applause. Only a stillness waited with recognition between two generations that had once stood on opposite sides of the same problem. Brooks lowered his hand. Thank you, he said, his voice deeper now. Not just for the truck. Roy nodded. Keep them safe, he said, looking toward the formation. That's the only thing that matters. Brooks turned to the soldiers. You hear that? Yes, sir, they replied together. Roy stepped back. He no longer stood at the center. He gave that space back to the young. His role was finished. No more words were needed. And from a lesson learned in mud and mission pressure, what remained began to stretch beyond any single individual, quietly becoming a shared memory, ready to be carried forward as a legacy. The convoy rolled on as if nothing had ever gone wrong. No one raised their voice. No one spoke about what had just happened. Mud still clung to the tires, to pant legs, to sleeves, but within the formation, breathing had returned to normal. Each person returned to their task, more deliberate, now slower, more careful. The mission was still the mission, but the way they moved into it had changed. In the logistics report, amid dry lines about timing, load weight, and routes, a short note appeared. Not highlighted, not explained. Patton Twist, Instructor Roy. The line offered no explanation. It didn't need to. Those who were there would understand. Those who read it later, if curious enough, would ask. And when they did, the story would be told not as an anecdote, but as a lesson. Walter Roy Hayes didn't stay to watch the convoy leave. He turned away, cane in hand, and walked toward the road leading out of the mud field. His pace was slow, but not heavy. He carried nothing with him but himself. No one ran after him. No one called out. The respect shown to him wasn't in pleading words, it was in letting him leave the same way he arrived, quietly. Roy stepped beyond the mission area and returned to his everyday path. There he was, no longer the man who taught the Patton Twist. He was just an old man heading back to a late lunch, back to a familiar rhythm of life. What he left behind wasn't on his person. It stayed with the young soldiers who had just learned to listen to the ground before giving it orders. Lieutenant Ethan Brooks stood for a moment longer, watching the formation move out. He said nothing. In his mind, the commands he had given were being reordered not by rank, but by reason. When he turned back to the unit, his voice was lower. "We continue," he said. No more words were needed. In the days that followed, Brooks changed the way he led. Not with speeches, but with questions. He asked his team before issuing commands. He paused an extra beat before deciding. And when faced with uncertainty, he remembered the man who had shown him that sometimes the answer isn't doing something harder, but doing it differently. An old form of knowledge was passed on, one not found in books. It had no standardized diagrams, no table of contents. It lived as memory spoken, calmly, proven through action, confirmed by undeniable results. It was passed down not because it was old, but because it was true. There are lessons that do not come from academies, but from people who once survived when they had no margin for error. The young soldiers in that formation would continue to serve. They would carry many things with them, new skills, new technology, new pressures. But somewhere, when data is insufficient and time does not allow trial and error, they will remember a piece of wood, a single sentence, and a man who taught them how to let a vehicle stand on its own. If this story makes you believe that honor and kindness never retire, the narrator's voice softens. Please, share this video and subscribe to Service Honor Stories so no memory like theirs is ever forgotten. Because people like Roy do not seek recognition, but what they leave behind deserves to be remembered. Service Honor Stories. We remember the quiet heroes